Hello, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the Attention Please podcast, now on video. So if you like this podcast, please do consider subscribing to this channel and liking this video and sharing it with your friends. I also have a Patreon page. So if you like this podcast and you want it to continue, then please consider becoming a monthly Patreon. The Patreon page is at Great Bar. So for those of you who've known me, who have bought my books, you know that there are certain topics which I love commenting on. One is Pakistan, one is cricket, one is cybersecurity, and one is vulgar songs. And when all of them come together, I obviously have to cover the story. So for those of you who are not following the news and were living under a rock, what happened was that New Zealand and then England were supposed to come and tour Pakistan. Now, what happened was the New Zealand cricketing team, they came to Pakistan, and after incurring, among other things, a bill of 27 lakhs for biryani, that was the amount of biryani bill that their security detail billed the Pakistan Cricket Board, they decided basically on the day of the match to pull out of the series. Now, according to news, Imran Khan, or the Great Dal, he called the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and I guess pleaded with her for them not to pull out of the series. And she said that this was a decision which the New Zealand Cricket Board has taken, and so there's nothing that she could do. Well, of course, she could have done something, but she chose not to, and I'll come to that. And then Pakistan, of course, Ramiz Raja and Shoaib Akhtar, all of them went postal and said, "Hum dekh lenge Maidan-e-Jung mein," which of course reminded me of the song Peter Bole Kitty Kitty. And for those of you who don't know about Maidan-e-Jung or don't know about this song, please go and Google it. It's on YouTube. So what happens with Pakistan, that whenever something happens, they ultimately find India to blame. And so their information and broadcasting minister then came out within this hilarious press conference where they said that they had been able to trace. By the way, the New Zealand Cricket Board did not and still has not provided any kind of public statement as to what intelligence led them to pull out of the Pakistan tour. And later on, England also decided to pull out, and they also did not give any specific intel reasons why they decided to pull out of the Pakistan tour. But anyways, so the information and broadcasting minister for Pakistan then gave a press conference in which basically what he said was that it was India, of course, everything is India's fault. So apparently there was somebody from India who sent a threatening email under this name of a known Pakistani terrorist to the wife of a New Zealand cricketer. And this cricketer was Martin Guptill. And as part of their evidence, because of course every accusation from Pakistan is backed by solid evidence, and we know that after watching Money Heist, that Pakistani cybersecurity and cyber hackers are the best in the world, that they had managed to trace, that they said that this email was sent from, of course, Gmail using a VPN, and the VPN, the address was from Singapore, but then they were able to identify that it was an IP address. From that IP address, they were even able to identify the SIM card number, and it was obviously an Indian Hindu citizen that had done it. Now, as far as I know, when somebody is using a VPN service, until and unless the VPN service provider is keeping the IP address, and most professional VPN service providers do not keep the IP address. And even if they keep the IP address, they usually provide it only to law enforcement officials. So if it was a VPN service from Singapore, it's highly unlikely that they would provide it to the Pakistani government within these few days. Virtually impossible. But if the Pakistani Information and Broadcasting Minister says so, it must be true, because after all, their Prime Minister Imran Khan, as we have been told by Shobha De, is the best Prime Minister. So apparently so the first thing was that they somehow managed to get the records of a Singapore-based VPN provider, and of course that traced to India. Point number one. And point number two, they were somehow able to associate an IP address with a SIM card. And given that the SIM card was possibly issued in India, and unless the Indian government is also collaborating with them, or basically they have hacked the Indian government, whatever it is, There's no way they would have been able to make the association with an IP address to the SIM card. Anyways, they were able to do all of it. And not that I'm doubting them for even a second. And then they even identified the individual who was a person by the name of Om Prakash something. And whenever I say Om Prakash, from my old Hindi film knowledge, I can only think of Hari Om Prakash. And so the Om Prakash, I've forgotten the last name. This person is famous for creating these vulgar rap song called Aunty Ki Ghanti. So they basically blamed the Aunty Ki Ghanti guy for sending an email, just one email, which led to New Zealand pulling out of their entire cricketing commitment. So very believable. And again, I'm not commenting on why they chose this guy, the Aunty Ki Ghanti guy. And don't ask me what Aunty Ki Ghanti means. I have no idea. I've never had any idea of these things. I guess it perhaps stems from Enrique Iglesias' song, Ring My Bell, Ring My Bell, and the answer is Aunty Ki Ghanti. I don't know. I'm not going to conjecture on it. But whatever it is, that's kind of outside the story, though it might be more interesting than the main story. But the thing is that New Zealand decided to pull out of the Pakistan cricket tour, incurring a lot of loss to PCB. Now, here is my comment on this. So, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, is known as the world's best Prime Minister, just as, or at least is known as the world's best Prime Minister by our Indian newspapers. Just like, of course, Chota Thackeray is known as the best Indian Chief Minister, the current Chief Minister. Not that I'm doubting any of this. This obviously, both of them are true. He is the best Chief Minister, and Jacinda Ardern is the best Prime Minister, because she's been able to contain COVID in a country which is the size of a municipality in India, and which is surrounded by the ocean, and which has very strict entry criteria. So of course, it's a great achievement for her to be able to control COVID. And look at our Indian administrators who are unable to control COVID in cities which are hundreds of times their size and basically have open borders. But let's keep that to the side for now. But one of the things that Prime Minister Ardern was known for was her wearing after the attacks at Christchurch, her performative wokeness and her stance against Islamophobia, which at that point of time was thoroughly applauded, and people pointed to our Prime Minister Narendra Modi and said, look at him and look at Jacinda Ardern. She's so taking a stance against global Islamophobia. And here's my critique of performative wokeness, is that when really push comes to shove, it is all about the PR. I mean, Jacinda Ardern had an opportunity here to take an actual stance against Islamophobia. Now, I'm going to say that if Pakistan feels a little hard done by, they should. They were hard done by New Zealand. So everybody knows Pakistan's history with terrorism. Everybody knows that Osama bin Laden was an honored guest in their country, living, as Jon Stewart once said, within a pizza delivery distance of their military headquarters. So Pakistan's record of terrorism, despite what they will tell you, is well known in the world. So people might not recognize it publicly, but everybody knows. So given that, the New Zealand government decided to go ahead with this tour. So it's not that the New Zealand Cricket Board can just willy-nilly or unilaterally go and decide to tour Pakistan. They have to go through the appropriate approvals from the New Zealand government. So the New Zealand government was on board with this. So they were a stakeholder into this decision. Now, whatever it was, I'm not saying there was nothing, there was perhaps something, but it was not significant enough that the New Zealand authorities were comfortable sharing it with their Pakistani authorities, because that was one of the things that everybody in Pakistan was saying. What is the big problem? Tell us what new intel you got. And so we can assure you, if you tell us what the problem is, and they kind of refused to tell what the problem was. So, and by the way, this whole Aunty Ki Ghanti thing hasn't been confirmed by New Zealand cricket at all. So this possibly is entirely a figment of the Pakistani Information and Broadcasting Minister's mind, by the way. So here the Prime Minister of New Zealand, so whatever it was that had spooked the New Zealand cricketers, and let's call a spade a spade. The fact is that there is, and again, surprising here that I am speaking for the Pakistanis in this case, because I genuinely think they have cause to feel hard done by, because everything about Pakistan is well known, right? If you go to, if you as an adult take a decision to, let's say, go skydiving, you know what skydiving is, right? So you just can't be that once I'm on the plane and realize, oops, this is skydiving, then it's your problem. So New Zealand and England, of course, they know very well where they were going. They know that there's been a history of cricketers being attacked. Sri Lankans were attacked. And they also know that, that the Taliban has taken over in Afghanistan. They have freed some prisoners who have, let's just say, interests in Pakistan. So all of this was well known. So there was nothing new that happened on the day that they pulled out of the tour. So ultimately, what do I think happened? The thing that happens is that ultimately the players, it comes from the players. They get spooked. They go to Pakistan, then they realize that, you know what, it's not worth it with COVID protocols, with everything. We're better off not playing here. And so then they decide to make some kind of excuse. Now, that is where the phobia part of it, it's not Islamophobia, it's more a, brown country phobia. They would have done the exact same thing in India. There are two reasons why they don't do it. Well, actually, there's one reason. We pay them very well. That's the main reason why they don't do it. That's the reason. There was a time in which, in the 80s and 90s, when definitely in the 70s and 80s, when the best English cricketers and Australian cricketers wouldn't tour India, because they just felt it was a filthy third world nation and they didn't want to have anything to do with us. So everything changed after we started making money. And that was when they realized that, and of course, our infrastructure also improved. That's also true. But now in India, there is not a problem. Now, of course, there's this thing is that everybody also knows that India is not the manufacturer of the terror. We're the victims of terror. That's not particularly true for Pakistan. But again, these were facts which were all known. So what special thing did you find out on that morning? It was basically, there was nothing. So this entire withdrawal of tour is just because from touring Pakistan. And this is where I think the larger point is, that here is the place where Prime Minister Ardern could have taken a stance, in favor of an Islamic country. And I'm not saying, going out of her way. This was not something that is from the goodness of her heart. This is what they should have done. Once they have committed to tour Pakistan, they have to provide publicly a reason sufficiently severe enough for them to withdraw from the tour, which they did not do. They did not believe that it behooved them to even give a public explanation as to what exactly specific intel they have. Because if it is a terrorism intel, then maybe they should share it with everybody. So they didn't. And so this was a chance for her to actually live up to her ideals, but it's obviously that, performative workness, the thing about it is its performativeness. So the whole thing was her, that photo op, wearing a hijab, that was the photo op that she was going for. She wasn't prepared to risk anything. And so this is where the rubber really hits the road. If you really believe that this is all phobia and this is all racism, then okay, why don't you live up to that? Why don't you follow up through your commitment to tour New Zealand, which you decided to do, knowing fully well Pakistan and its history? And given that, then say why you decided to pull out. And the same thing holds true for England. Now, coming to, of course, Pakistan blaming India, I happened to watch this TV series on Amazon Prime called Mumbai Diaries. So normally I avoid making commentary on bad web series, and this was very bad. But I mean, it was bad because it was just badly made. It was essentially a medical drama, starts out as a medical drama kind of ER, and then Grey's Anatomy ER, and then suddenly takes a turn to the macabre, where it becomes like an action thriller with Kasab and all of them getting into the hospital and taking people hostage. It's just bizarre. And it's bizarre for many reasons. The one thing that it's bizarre for is that it fictionalizes 26/11, as if 26/11 isn't dramatic enough. And for many people who don't know the details, unfortunately, they will think that what happened, because this is being made and ultimately can be viewed by an international audience. And it nowhere explicitly do the makers make it clear that this is absolutely fictional, because they kind of mix fact with fiction, even with the names. So they take the name of Trident, for instance, but they call it they they call the Taj the Palace Hotel. So they change some names. I'm guessing they didn't get permission to use the actual hotel name, but I don't know why they also changed the names of the terrorists. I don't know if there was also some copyright issue with the terrorists. I don't know. I'm joking, of course. But it's this strange dance between fact and fiction. And while doing so, they do a few terrible things. And I'm not just saying they murdered the art of movie making. That's there. But there are two things that they do that I found particularly offensive. One was the fact that they totally eliminated the role of the real heroes, the actual heroes of 2611. They don't find any place in the narrative. So they're kind of erased. That's one thing. And second thing is that they make 2611 a Hindu-Muslim thing, which I felt was reprehensible. So there is a place in which one of the obviously very obvious villainish Hindu characters, of course, after 2611 happens, and he starts blaming the Muslim doctor who's there, and he kind of holds him by the collar, says, "You did it." And then there is this, and again, it has all these old Hindi movie tropes kind of shoveled and shoehorned into a modern web series, a gritty web series. It was really funny. So it had that old Farida Jalal kind of character also, who was dying on a bed, and who was the, Farida Jalal meets A.K. Hangal kind of character, itna sannata kyun hai bhai type of character. So first of all, and I lived through 2611 like most of you listening to this podcast or seeing this podcast, is that nobody during 2611 communalized the issue. Everybody in India, we were united in identifying the enemy, that the enemy was Pakistan. It was not a Hindu versus Muslim thing. Every Indian was attacked that day. And there was not a single communal incident in those days. And for this TV series to deliberately rake up that issue, to deliberately create, because it is totally fiction, something that didn't exist, is mischievousness at its, I have no other words to say that, other than deliberate mischievousness. And then, of course, that BG, the Farida Jalal character that makes the connection, this is that same old thing. Oh, it's not just, communalism is a curse. And then she brings up the 1984 Sikh riots as like Hindu on other people. But again, the history thing, there have been Hindu-Muslim communal incidents. And the movie maker, if the movie maker was serious, could have brought up 1992 Bombay riots. But they decided to go with, and there's a reason for that, because, remember the party which was accused of doing that? They're currently the vanguard of secularism and centrism in India, right? The Shiv Sena. So that's why they don't want to go it. That's the best chief minister part of it. That's why they don't want to bring up that example. So they bring up 1984, which essentially wasn't a Hindu-Muslim riot. It was a Congress Sikh riot. It was Congress in their religion of Indira Gandhi taking retribution on Sikhs. It was not a Hindu Sikh riot. So again, none of these things are accidental, in my opinion. And I find that, other than the fact that this was very badly made, I just find these things to be, I couldn't finish the last 15 minutes of this TV series. I was just so enraged by this. And I shouldn't. I'm too old to be enraged by these things. Been around the block too many times. But just this, it's 2611. Some things should be given some respect. I know this is kind of subjective and I kind of sound a little jingoistic here. But some things, 2611, come on, give me a break. You want to create an action thriller, make an action thriller, man. Nobody's forbidding you. You want to put that Hindu, Muslim, old, that old shit. Go ahead, do it. Absolutely. Just don't set it in the background of 2611. Don't use real people's names. Don't use real timelines. Don't use Leopold Cafe. Don't layer on fiction onto something which was tragic and dramatic. And again, Put the blame where it is. If you're going to do it, show what actually happened. Show that India was not divided. That was the intent. The intent of 2611 wasn't just to go up and blow up a few hotels and kill a few people. The reason why it was organized was to divide India. It was done to then blame the entire incident on Hindu right-wing extremists, because all of them were dressed as that. That was why there was 2611 RSS ka sazish, in which a major Congress leader was a part of it, a part of the book release. This was all a part of an overall narrative that this was essentially a Hindu right-wing attack. And that was why Hemant Karkare was a target. So again, rather than going, you may want to go through this, you may not want to go through this, but whatever it be, if you are making a TV series on 2611, at least the bare minimum you can do is not to turn around that narrative, not to make it about Hindu Muslim, which it was absolutely not. And again, if you want to make a point, then refer to the Mumbai riots of the early 90s, but you will not at this point of time, because that is not where you want to go. So this has been my persistent problem with, the left liberal progressives who control Amazon Prime and Netflix, is that, hey, you want to do messaging, it's fine, but be truthful. Don't mix masala with truth and create your own version. And unfortunately that's what happens with these things, because sooner or later people who lived through this will forget, and they will remember these things through books and through movies, unfortunately. And this itself will become the truth. And there will be enough people who will want to say that, yes, this was the truth. Now, the final thing that I wanted to conclude this episode today was, we had 20 years of 9/11. And one of the ironic things was, George W. Bush coming out and comparing the people who attacked US in 9/11 with the January 6th white nationalists under Trump, and basically saying something like they're cut from the same foul cloth, or some other metaphor that I cannot at this moment remember. So let's just take a step back and just contemplate the sheer chutzpah of George W. Bush. Now, I am no fan of Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump is a crook. Donald Trump is a confidence artist. And Donald Trump is incompetent in every sense of the term. But there's one thing that Donald Trump did not do, which was that Donald Trump did not cynically get America into a war, knowing fully well the human casualties of what was going to happen because of A, business interests, and 2, because of personal animus. And this is exactly what George W. Bush did. So when people say that Trump was a worse president than George W. Bush, I would say they're not even comparable. It's like the proverbial apples to oranges. So again, Trump ultimately left with a huge body count, but that was because of mismanagement of COVID. Again, it was one thing to mismanage a pandemic, which is not his fault. And it's the one thing to willfully send people into harm's way, into a country which had nothing to do with 9/11. It is on record that right after the planes hit, George Bush and his executive staff were repeatedly trying to pin this on Iraq. They wanted to go to war against Iraq. And the reason why they wanted to go to war against Iraq was because they were partners with the Saudi government, with the Carlyle Group, had dealings with the Saudi government, and Saddam Hussein was the biggest enemy of the Saudi government. He had sent in missiles into Kuwait. He had invaded Kuwait. So everything became about Iraq and Saddam Hussein right after the attacks happened. So this person, and this is now historic truth, this person willingly sent American soldiers into harm's way and killed thousands and millions of Iraqis and led to the ISIS growing in its place. So he ultimately actually fostered Islamic fundamentalism. That's George Bush's legacy to the world. And for this guy, for this shameless guy to then now pivot to become a progressive, very few people in the American media now criticize George W. Bush. because he has kind of managed to pivot himself to become this gentle old man drawing pictures and saying exact things that the progressives want him to say. George W. Bush is now a progressive. Cannot believe that. Now let's first talk about this equivalence. And we in India, we know this equivalence, right? Taliban, BJP, equivalent. We all know that this how this equivalence game works. But let's look at the equivalence game here. So what he wants to do is he wants to take the people who attacked America 9/11. This was a conspiracy that was years in the making. It had global players. There were enormous amount of money that went into backing it. The people who carried it out were like soldiers carrying out an operation. And the effect of what it cost in terms of the loss of life, and yes, magnitude does count. That's why, stealing a candy bar from a grocery store isn't the same as robbing a bank. So saying both these thieves are cut from the same foul cloth is disingenuous at best. And it's of course disingenuous given who is saying so. So if it was Michael Moore saying so, okay. George Bush saying so, oh, please. So on one hand, you have this. On one hand, the January 6th guys were essentially social media trolls who decided to show up. They themselves took selfies of themselves doing it. There was absolutely no planning. Then they went, even the ones who went out, then went and told everyone, hey, we did this. There was a real estate agent who was advertising for a real estate there itself. So to compare the sheer amateurishness of this with I hesitate to use the word, but this is a war. From 9/11 was war. And to compare war with essentially a protest that got out of hand by, rowdy, they were white nationalists. That's true. They were white nationalists. There's no doubt about it. But the magnitude of what they did, the amount of effort that went into it, the amount of thought that went into it, and the sheer intelligence of these people. I mean, the guys who did this, they were like dressed up as if they were in a fancy dress party. So this was all about demonstration, all about social media, all about likes. And yes, it got out of hand. That's true. But 9/11 isn't even comparable to that. So to compare these two, and that too from George W. Bush, it just blows your mind. And so the last question is, what has prompted this metamorphosis of George W. Bush? And that's perhaps is the most interesting part of the story. So at one point of time, George W. Bush represented the hard right. It's not George W. Bush, but George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld. They were known as neocons. So the entire thing was they were very aggressive when it came to, and based on the progressive definitions, they would qualify to be white nationalists actually, because they are driven by nationalism and in expanding US influence all over the world. I mean, that's the classic definition of what nationalism is to conquer other countries, is to do regime change. And those guys were it. I mean, they actually did it. So now what has happened is over the years, and this is purely the Trump phenomenon, that the Bush family was somewhat like the Ghanti family on the right of the US. So there was Jeb Bush, there was of course the father Bush, who was also the president, there was George W. So they kind of had an entitlement on the Republican Party. They felt that they would, it's their really hereditary business. And Trump basically destroyed that family in terms of its political prospects. In one debate, he basically took out Jeb Bush and through that. And it was not just he was going after the Bushes as a political opponent. He went after Bush in a personal way. That's the thing with Trump. And that's what gets him his fans, because he does not go after ideas. He has none. He goes after people in the true sense of a reality show star. So his main thing is to attack the personality. Who cares what that guy thinks? I might even agree with that guy. Who cares? So he destroyed the Bushes. He destroyed the entire heritage of the Bushes and what they feel is due to them. And that's why George W. Bush and anybody with the last name of Bush, I think, cannot forget that fact. So at this point of time, to them, Trump is no different from Osama bin Laden. This is This is amazing coming from a president of a country or thinking about another president of the same country. But this is not a question of principle. George Bush has no principles. This is purely a matter of personal animus, that George W. Bush feels that Trump went after him and his family. So now he has to go after him and his supporters by basically equating them to Osama bin Laden. That's how bad they are. It's not that they're incompetent. It's not that they're racist. It's not that they're, that they're crooks. Trump is a crook. That's not the thing. Those are valid criticisms. Now one could say, coming from George Bush, it kind of sounds a little hollow, but George Bush at least is not directly a crook. Okay, his corruption is a little bit more subtle. Trump is very, very Kadir Khan kind of thing going on there. Kadir Khan in Chalbaz, that kind of trickery. He's that kind of confidence trickster. Baap numbari, beta das numbari could very well be the Trump biopic name. So these are valid criticisms to make of Trump, but for George Bush to equate him and his supporters to Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, given that he is the guy, George Bush is the guy, him and his cronies are the guys who killed so many Americans and so many Iraqis purely for oil and purely because of their relationship with the Saudis and purely because of, once again, his personal animus. Because if you guys remember, Donald Rumsfeld used to operate in Iraq, and there are and they used to go like this to Saddam Hussein till they were kicked out. So this was revenge. This was personal revenge. Bush and his cronies used the American apparatus to conduct a war for personal revenge, for personal aggrandizement, and they sent their own citizens into harm's way. And honestly, I cannot think of a bigger crime than this. And for them to now turn around and blame, fools, essentially. There's a difference between fools and those who are thoughtfully evil. And that's the difference between George Bush and those people. There's a difference between somebody who, and there's a difference, right? A murder, it is murder, right? But if you kill somebody because you had a barroom fight with that person and his head hit the table versus you planned somebody's murder over years, the punishment is very different. And so again, and George W. Bush knows this, but this is done purely as basically red meat to the progressive crowd, because George Bush now wants his legacy to be remembered as that of a progressive, and for people to forget the number of people, the body count that he has tied to his name, both American citizens as well as Iraqis. They did not have to die. None of these people had to die. A false war was fought. And the fact that he has escaped accountability for it and is asking for accountability from people who Instagrammed their moments of notoriety, it just blew my mind. It just blew my mind, the chutzpah, and the fact that nobody in the US media, very few people in the US media even called him out on that. Because since now he's on their side, everything is okay. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody, for listening to this podcast. I'll be back hopefully next week. Till then, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and everybody